My name is Annie. I'm a dog trainer, and I'm currently training to become a, canine behaviorist. And today we're going to be talking all about separation anxiety. Before I get started, I'd love to know what you've heard is the best way to deal with separation anxiety. If you want, you could put it in the chat. So one of the most common pieces of advice that people are given can actually make separation anxiety worse, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And also feel free to turn on your cameras. It's always nice to be able to see who I'm talking to. Before we dive in, I just want to briefly explain the type of dog training that I use. It is called concept dog training. So instead of focusing only on changing behavior, we focus on understanding our dog's brains, how they function, and why certain behaviors happen. So once we understand what's driving the behavior, we can teach our dogs the concept they need to overcome those challenges. And concepts are just skills that our dogs either have or don't have yet. So we do this through playing training games that help dogs build and grow those concepts or skills that they need for everyday life. All right, so today we are talking all about separation anxiety, what it really is, how to recognize it, and why some of the most common pieces of advice don't work, and what we can do instead. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So when people think about separation anxiety, they often think about the barking, the distraction, the pacing, or the whining. But those behaviors aren't actually the problem. They're symptoms of an emotional struggle. Separation anxiety isn't an obedience problem, and it isn't the dog being naughty or difficult. It's an emotional response to being left alone. Our goal isn't simply to stop the barking or stop the destruction. Our goal is to change how the dog feels when they are alone. So once we change the emotion, then the behavior changes with it. One of the easiest things that you can do is simply record your dog while you're away to really get a better understanding of their separation anxiety, because for every dog it is different. So most of us aren't home when these behaviors aren't happening. We don't actually know what they are doing. You can simply set up your phone or a tablet or have a camera in your house to record them when you leave. One thing that's really important is looking at when the behavior actually starts. Dogs experiencing separation anxiety will often begin showing signs of distress within the first few minutes after you leave. So if your dog starts barking, pacing, trying to escape, whining or panicking almost immediately after you've left, that's very different from a dog that starts chewing a cushion after an hour because they're bored. So the timing can give us valuable information about what is actually driving the behavior. So some common signs of separation anxiety include barking or whining, pacing, destructive behavior, attempts to escape, drooling, panting, having accidents in the house, and being unable to settle. So it's also important to remember that some dogs struggle even before we leave the house. So they may follow you everywhere. They may become worried when you stand up. They might watch your every movement or become anxious when you do certain movements. So things like picking up your keys. We'll come back to that and why it happens later, because it's a really important piece of the puzzle. All right. So one of the biggest mistakes that people make is assuming that separation anxiety is simply a lack of exercise. So you've probably heard people say, oh, just take your dog for a really long walk before you leave. Or if you tire your dog out enough, they'll just sleep while you're gone. Exercise is incredibly important for our dogs, but exercise alone doesn't prevent separation anxiety. Exercise and relaxation are not the same thing. So a dog can be physically tired while still feeling emotionally overwhelmed. In fact, if a dog's arousal levels are already high, constantly adding more excitement through long runs or intense games of fetch or other highly stimulating activities can sometimes make emotional regulation even harder. So when I refer to arousal levels, I just mean mental activation or physical activation. So instead of asking, how do I tire my dog out? A better question is, how do I help my dog feel calm? Because calmness is what allows dogs to recover from stressful experiences. It's where healing happens. And that's why understanding what's happening inside your dog's brain is so important. So before we talk about how to help dogs with separation anxiety, I think it's useful to briefly understand what's happening inside their brain. I covered this in much more detail in my previous meetup. So today I'm just going to give you the highlights because it explains why dogs behave the way they do when they are left home alone. So when dogs experience separation anxiety, they're primarily using the emotional part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is the brain's threat detector. Its job is constantly asking questions like, is this safe? Do I need to pay attention? Could this be dangerous? The amygdala is incredibly fast. It's emotional, it's reactive. Its job isn't to stop and carefully think things through. Its job is survival. So if your dog's brain believes something could be dangerous, the amygdala wants them to react first and ask questions later. So now we're going to compare that to another part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is the thinking part of the brain. So it's involved in decision making, impulse control, emotional regulation, problem solving, and learning. When dogs have access to their prefrontal cortex, they can pause before reacting. They can process information. They can make better decisions. And this is where learning happens. So this is the part of the brain we want our dogs using as often as possible. When a dog with separation anxiety hears you pick up your keys or watches you put on your shoes, they're often not stopping to think, oh, maybe nothing is going to happen. Instead, their amygdala immediately says, this is important. We've seen this before. My person is leaving, right? So their emotional brain takes over before their thinking brain has a chance to become involved. The brain communicates with the nervous system as well. So when the amygdala detects a threat, it activates the sympathetic nervous system. So this is often called the fight, flight, or freeze response. The body begins preparing to deal with what it believes is danger. So the heart rate increases, breathing changes, stress hormones are released, and the body becomes ready for action. So some of the main neurochemicals involved include adrenaline, which prepares the body for immediate action, and cortisol, which helps the body respond to ongoing stress. These chemicals are incredibly useful when a dog is facing a real emergency, but they aren't helpful when the threat is simply their owner leaving for work. So the opposite system is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is sometimes referred to as the rest and digest system. This is where recovery happens, where healing happens, where learning happens, and where calmness happens. When dogs are in a state, when dogs are in this state, they're much better able to think, process information, and make good decisions. So one of the reasons you'll hear me talk so much today about calmness and emotional regulation, we're not just trying to create dogs that look calm. we're trying to help their brains spend more time in a state where learning can actually take place. Because here's the important thing to remember. Dogs don't learn best when they're panicking, just like people, right? So they learn best when they feel safe. And that's exactly why so much of our separation anxiety training focuses on changing how the dog feels rather than simply trying to stop the behavior. So once we understand that, everything else we're going to talk about today starts to make much more sense. All right, so now we understand what's happening inside the brain. Let's look at some of the advice that people are most commonly given when their dogs have separation anxiety. Some of this advice comes from a good place, but unfortunately, it doesn't always address what's actually causing the problem. So one of the most common pieces of advice is to just let your dog cry it out. So this terminology actually comes from humans. Years ago, parents were often told to let their babies to cry until they eventually fell asleep. That approach has been widely debated, and today we know that simply stopping the crying doesn't necessarily mean the underlying distress has disappeared. And the same thing can happen with our dogs. So if we leave a dog at home to bark, scream, and panic, they may eventually become quiet, but at no point are they barking, 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 feeling all of this fear, and then suddenly thinking, oh, you know what, being alone actually isn't so bad. That's not what's happening. So instead, they may simply become exhausted, or they may stop responding outwardly while still experiencing the same emotional and physiological stress internally. The behavior hasn't changed. So the behavior has changed, but the emotion hasn't, right? So that's why our goal isn't simply to create a quiet dog. Our goal is to create a dog that genuinely feels safe when they're alone. Another very common piece of advice is to gradually increase the amount of time that your dog spends alone. For example, you might leave for 5 seconds and then 10 seconds and then 30 seconds and then 1 minute. For some dogs, this can be part of the training process, but there's an important piece that's often missing. Some dogs can't even cope with 5 seconds. Some dogs become distressed the moment you stand up. Some become worried when you walk into another room. Others won't even engage with something like a stuffed Kong or a chew because they're already too worried about what might happen next. That's why separation anxiety is such an individualized process. So the goal isn't simply to increase time. The goal is to understand why this particular dog is struggling and build the skills they need before asking them to tolerate longer periods alone. All right, so before we work on separation itself, we need to think about our dog's overall emotional state. Separation anxiety doesn't happen in isolation. So everything else that's happening in your dog's life affects how well they're able to cope. One of my favorite ways to explain this is with something we call the bucket. So imagine every dog has an emotional bucket, and throughout the day, different experiences pay into that bucket and fill the bucket. And some of those experiences are negative. So things like fear, frustration, pain, unexpected noises, anxiety, separation itself. But exciting things can also pay into the bucket. So things like fast games, highly stimulating walks, constant activity, busy routines, even positive excitement still creates high arousal. So enough of those experiences build up. Eventually, the bucket is going to fill and then overflow. And when that happens, we often start seeing behaviors like barking, destruction, reactivity, difficulty settling, or struggling to cope with being left alone. So one of the first questions we should ask ourselves is how full is my dog's bucket today? because if their bucket is already close to overflowing, asking them to suddenly cope with being alone becomes much more difficult. All right, so this brings us to one of the most important concepts or skills in behavior. Calmness isn't something we only work on before we leave the house. Calmness is a lifestyle. So dogs that know how to relax, recover more quickly, and from exciting or stressful events. When something does pay into the bucket, they have the skills to empty it again. So without those calming skills, the bucket stays full for much longer. That's why emotional regulation is such an important part of separation anxiety. So before we ask our dogs to cope with being alone, we need to help them become better at regulating their emotions throughout the entire day. So that might include things like passive calming activities. And that's stuff like long-lasting chews, stuffed Kongs, and snuffle mats. So any of your enrichment activities. Another thing is active rest. So that doesn't necessarily mean sleeping. That could just be laying down and relaxing in your living room. And we also want to reinforce calm choices. So when your dog just makes a calm choice by itself without you telling them to do something, so say if they go and lay down on their bed, you can reward them for that behavior. And creating a daily routine that gives the nervous system regular opportunities to recover. So the calmer a dog becomes in everyday life, the easier it becomes for them to cope with more challenging situations. All right, so once we've helped lower our dog's overall arousal levels and started building emotional regulation, we can begin teaching these specific skills that help dogs feel safe when they're alone. So rather than only focusing on how long a dog can stay home by themselves, I prefer to focus on building strong foundations first. So these foundations help change the dog's emotional response to separation instead of simply trying to suppress those behaviors. All right. So it's important to remember that separation isn't separate from behavior as a whole. The same foundational skills that help dogs cope with everyday life also help them cope with being alone. So some of the most important skills include disengagement, optimism, calmness, default calm behaviors, and frustration tolerance. So we'll just briefly go through what these look like. So for disengagement, dogs need the flexibility to disengage from things rather than becoming fixated on them. Some dogs struggle to disengage from movement. Some struggle to disengage from noises. Other dogs struggle to disengage from their owners. If a dog constantly watches every movement we make, it's going to be much harder for them to settle independently when we're gone. The next concept is optimism. So being alone is naturally uncertain for a social species like dogs. So some dogs tend to interpret uncertainty with more negativity than others. So they'll tend to be more pessimistic. So these dogs may startle easily. They may become worried by everyday noises, be cautious in unfamiliar situations, or generally just expect things to go wrong. If that's the case, optimism may need to become a priority before we even begin working on longer absences. Otherwise, the separation itself remains emotionally fragile. All right, so we've talked about calmness as a lifestyle, but calmness is also a skill. Dogs don't automatically know how to relax. So if something it's something that we can actively teach and reinforce. The better a dog becomes at calming themselves during everyday life, the better equipped they are to cope when they are alone. The next skill is frustration tolerance. So dogs also need to learn that not getting immediate access to something they want isn't the end of the world. So we want to teach them to wait, to pause, and they need to understand that they don't always need immediate access to us. These are all important life skills that help dogs cope with temporary separation. All right. So the next thing we focus on is the emotional meaning of human movement. Some dogs become incredibly emotionally attached to everything we do. They follow us from room to room. They watch us constantly. They become excited every time we stand up. Some even grab at our clothing or constantly seek interaction. For these dogs, human movement has become emotionally important. So our movement predicts attention, play, training, walks, food, interactions. The goal isn't for our dogs to ignore us. The goal is healthy coexistence. So we want our dogs to learn that sometimes humans simply move around the house. Not every movement involves them. Not every movement predicts something exciting. Sometimes we're just getting up to get a drink of water, right? Sometimes we're just folding the laundry. Sometimes we're just walking into another room. So when dogs stop feeling the need to monitor every movement we make, we begin developing much healthier independence. Okay, so this brings us to predictors. So many dogs don't become anxious when we actually leave. They become anxious long before that. So things like picking up the keys, putting on your shoes, putting on your coat, turning off the lights, closing your laptop, all these things can become predictors that we are about to leave. So over time, dogs begin putting these pieces together. The anxiety starts before we've even opened the door to leave. So that's why we need to think about changing the emotional meaning of these predictors rather than simply trying to sneak out of the house unnoticed. Our goal is for these everyday actions to become just that, everyday actions, not automatic signals that something scary is about to happen. All right, so now that we know predictors can trigger anxiety before we even leave the house, how do we change that emotional response? Many trainers teach a technique called DMT, which stands for Distraction Mark Treat. But today I want to introduce you to a slightly different way of thinking about it. It's called Settle, Disturb, React. So dogs generally respond to an event in one of three ways. So the first is settle. The dog notices something is happening but remains calm and unaffected. If a dog could talk, they might say, I noticed that, but it's not important. The second response is disturb. So the dog becomes aware of something. Maybe they lift their head, maybe their ears turn towards the sound, maybe they briefly look at what's happening, but after noticing it, they choose to settle again. So they might say, that caught my attention, but everything is okay. The third response is react. So this is where the dog moves into active emotional response. So they become worried, excited, alert. They feel like they need to do something. They might say, that's important. I need to respond. Now think about a dog with separation anxiety. So something as simple as putting on your shoes, picking up your keys, putting on your coat can immediately push them into that react response. So the amygdala becomes active, their arousal increases, their body begins preparing for something they already believe is worrying. So that's exactly what we want to change. Every dog exists on a continuum between settle, disturb, and react. So some dogs have a very large settle window, while other dogs will have a very small one. So how wide those windows are depends on things like genetics, previous learning experiences, and their environment. Our goal isn't to stop our dogs from noticing things. Noticing things is completely normal. Instead, we want to expand the settle and disturb windows while making the react window much smaller. So we do that through carefully controlled exposure. So if we present a predictor at a level where our dog can notice it, but can still settle again, we're teaching the brain that this event isn't actually something to worry about. However, if we push the dog into the full emotional reaction, then we've gone too far. So instead of changing the emotional response, we're simply rehearsing it again. All right. So one analogy that I really like is poke the bear. So imagine your dog is a bear hibernating peacefully. Our goal is to gently poke the bear just enough that its eyes open or one eye opens, but not enough that it jumps up roaring. So every gentle poke followed by the bear settling back down teaches that wasn't a big deal. So over time, the bear becomes less bothered by those small disturbances. But if we poke too hard, if the bear wakes up roaring, we've pushed too far. So that's exactly how predictor training works. We want to create very small disturbances that the dog notices, but can recover from. So that might mean standing up, changing your posture, picking up your keys, putting on your shoes, opening and closing a cupboard door, or picking up your bag. The goal isn't for the dog to ignore those things. The goal is for them to notice them and then choose to settle again. So every successful repetition slightly raises the threshold needed to trigger a reaction. So over time, those predictors lose emotional significance. Instead of predicting panic, they become just another ordinary part of everyday life. And if you stay until the end of this presentation, I will give you the step-by-step process on how to use settle, disturb, react with your own dogs. All right, so presence doesn't mean access is the next thing we're going to talk about. So this is probably one of the most important concepts when working through separation anxiety. Dogs need to learn that just because we're present doesn't automatically mean they have access to us. For many dogs, human presence predicts interaction. So it predicts play, training, comfort, attention, walks, or food. If human presence always predicts access, then human absence automatically predicts loss. So that emotional meaning drives separation distress. So instead, we want to teach calm coexistence. So we're both in the same house, we're both relaxed, but we're not constantly interacting. From there, we can begin adjusting different variables depending on the individual dog. So those variables could include time, how long is the dog comfortable without access, distance, how far away we can be, visual access. Can the dog see us or are we behind a barrier? Employment. So does the dog have something calm and appropriate to do, such as a long-lasting chew or a food toy? Every dog is different. Some dogs need more visual access, some need shorter durations, some benefit from appropriate employment. The training should always fit the individual dog. All right, so containment is another area that's often misunderstood. So many people think that crate training automatically teaches a dog to be comfortable alone. But being comfortable in a crate isn't necessarily the same thing as being comfortable home alone. Containment is simply one tool that we can use while building separation skills. The important thing is that containment feels safe and predictable and calm, emotionally neutral, not exciting, not frustrating, and not punishment. Whether you're using a crate, a puppy pen, gates, or a safe room, we want our dogs to learn that temporary restriction is completely normal. So one exercise I like is teaching dogs that even losing visual access to us can predict good things. So for example, once a dog is calmly settled in their crate, you can briefly block their view with a towel while calmly delivering treats. The goal isn't to force the dog to cope, The goal is helping them learn that not seeing us for a moment isn't something to worry about. All right, so finally, we need to think about departures and arrivals. So rather than suddenly disappearing, we want departures to grow naturally out of all the skills we've already been building. So dogs spend time calmly contained. We can move around the house. We can briefly leave. We return. The dog experiences lots of successful, low pressure separations before we ever ask them to stay home for longer periods. Returns are just as important. When we come home, it's very tempting to make it a huge celebration, but highly emotional reunions can actually increase anticipation about us returning. So instead, we want our arrivals to be calm and predictable. So maybe we come inside, we put our things away, we take our dog outside, or we sit down together. The goal is for leaving and returning to simply become ordinary parts of everyday life. When we put all these foundations together, we're no longer just trying to make a dog tolerate being alone. We're helping them build the emotional skills and confidence they need to genuinely feel safe when they're by themselves. All right, so we've covered a lot today. So let's quickly just bring everything together. When people first start dealing with separation anxiety, it's completely understandable that they want a quick solution. Most people simply want to know, what do I do so my dog stops barking when I leave? But hopefully today you've seen that separation anxiety is much more complex than that. It's not simply about teaching a dog to stay home. It's about changing how they feel about being alone. When we focus only on the behavior, we often miss what's driving the behavior in the first place. So instead, we need to think about the whole dog. So their emotional state, their ability to regulate themselves, the skills they already have, the meaning they've attached to our movements, the predictors that signal that we're about to leave, and how they cope with frustration, how comfortable they are with temporary separation. And when we start building those foundations, separation itself becomes much less overwhelming. So one thing I always encourage people to remember is that separation anxiety isn't your dog's fault. They're not trying to make life difficult. They're experiencing genuine emotional distress. And because of that, our job isn't to force them through it, right? So our job is to help them develop the confidence and emotional skills they need to feel safe. It takes patience and consistency, and every dog progresses at their own pace. Some dogs move through the process quite quickly, while others need to take much smaller steps. Neither one is right or wrong. The training should always fit the individual dog in front of us. All right, so if you remember just a few things from today's webinar, I hope it's these. So separation anxiety is an emotional problem. It's not an obedience problem. Behavior is communication. Exercise alone won't solve separation anxiety. Calmness and emotional regulation matter. Predictors begin long before we actually leave the house. And building independence starts while we're still home. Our goal isn't simply to help dogs tolerate being alone. Our goal is to help them genuinely feel safe. And that's a very different way of looking at separation anxiety, and it changes how we approach training. Right. So if you are interested in working with me, you can book a free behavior and training consultation on my website, healingdogs.ca, and that's done over Zoom. And as promised, if you go to predictors.healingdogs.ca, you can get the step-by-step process to eliminate those predictors. And you will be able to download my Settle, Disturb, React guide. So